Of our research, ESTAR Sarah's research, into a significant new archival acquisition, a large steamer trunk of documents and artifacts that, if the slides will permit, we'll go on to discuss, which appears to open tantalizing windows onto more than a century of radical attentional practices in and around the Seattle region. Dubbed, for reasons that will become clear, the Frye Trunk, this unusual suitcase has presented a host of challenges to those of us who study the history of the Avis Tertia, the Order of the Third Bird, and many questions remain unresolved. We are unable, at present, to confirm with confidence who created the trunk or whose possessions it contains. Problems of provenance and authenticity continue to dog our investigations. Nevertheless, there can be no doubt that the Frye Trunk is a compelling boîte en valise for those fascinated by the Order of the Third Bird. In what follows, then, we seek to unpack this peculiar portable storage unit in the hopes of drawing attention to its contents and the attentional stories, practices, and mysteries we discern therein. We expect, perhaps unreasonably, that the majority of our audience will have already secured a general understanding of the work of ESTAR Sarah, and consequently will have some familiarity with the subject of our ongoing research, the birds. And it is to be expected that no small number of those picking up this catalog pamphlet, or in the audience today, are established readers of the Proceedings of ESTAR Sarah, the long-standing journal within which series we present this special number monograph. 16 key essays from that publication, which can be hard to find in a full run and tends to be preserved only in specialist academic collections, have recently been gathered in book form and are available as In Search of the Third Bird, exemplary essays from the Proceedings of ESTAR Sarah, 2001-2021, edited by D. Graham Burnett, Catherine Hansen, and Justin E.H. Smith. Those interested in a concise one-stop shop for much of the best scholarship achieved by associates of ESTAR Sarah over the last 20 years are encouraged to acquire and peruse that volume, which can be acquired in the Frye Museum store. Still, an abbreviated overview of the research program that frames our Frye Trunk study will be of use to those coming upon our work for the first time. In short, then, ESTAR Sarah, or the Aesthetical Society for Transcendental and Applied Realization, now incorporating the Society of Aesthetic Realizers, is a distributed community of scholars, conservators, amateurs, and others concerned with the historically oriented study of practices of attention, broadly speaking, and more narrowly with that distinctive community of radical practitioners of collective, durational attention called the Order of the Third Bird, or Ordo Avis Tertiae. The birds, as they are often known, are not easy to trace. A loose network of mischievous attentionauts, the order has tended to fly under the historical radar, preferring playful private capers and sub rosa attentional actions. Exactly what the birds do, where and when they do it, and above all, why, these are questions more easily asked than answered, but it has been for decades the business of ESTAR Sarah to ask and answer precisely these questions. Those of us who work under the banner of ESTAR Sarah are thus, in effect, students of the birds, and our work is the work of shedding light on their doings. In this delicate labor, we are in possession of a vault of great value, the so-called W cache, a rich archive of documents and artifacts bequeathed to ESTAR Sarah by persons associated with its founding. Although the exact origin of the collection remains a subject of debate, and despite various custodial challenges that the cache itself has presented over the years, there can be no doubt that its holdings represent an extraordinary collation of sources that bear directly on the history, commitments, and activities of those associated with the Avis Tertia across several centuries. Gradually surfacing these materials, scrutinizing and interpreting them, this has been the primary work of ESTAR Sarah since its foundation, and much of the fruit of that collaborative labor may be consulted in the pages of the Proceedings and our other publications. Fruit is a charged term where the birds are connected. The Order of the Third Bird derives its unusual name from lore linked to a famous story about art and fruit and even creatures. Pliny's natural history recounts the tale of legendary painter genius named Zeuxis, whose talents were such that wild birds came to peck at grapes in one of his pictures. While bystanders gawked in amazement, Zeuxis himself scoffed. Pointing out that the grapes in question were being carried by a painted boy, the artist is supposed to have complained that if the child were painted as well as the grapes, the birds would have been scared off. In a later riff on this tale, a retelling associated, rightly or wrongly, with the Latin poet Ausonius, Zeuxis supposedly reworked the painting and again set it outside to see what would happen. And we are told that 3 birds now approached. The first, apparently frightened by the newly improved child, flew off with a screech. The second went for the grapes as before, but the third bird simply landed in front of the painting and stared at it for a long time, looking for all the world like a connoisseur. We know that associates of the order take that third bird as their inspiration and namesake, and it would seem that they understand this canny and contemplative beast to represent sustained attention as such, and/or the recognition of the work as a work, which is to say, as a kind of reified request for attention. Fully unfolding how the birds have played out these ideas would be the full history of the British persuasion, and that is a story that goes well beyond this brief introduction. It will be sufficient for now to say that associates of the Avis Tertia, working in small groups, have for a very long time, in various locations and under various conditions, gathered for a wide variety of semi-formalized practices of sustained attention to a wide range of made things, often works of art in a traditional sense, but also a mishmash of other objects that strike their avian fancy or are in particular need of their attention. They generally work according to attentional scores that guide or prompt the music-like movements of their collective occasions. These phases, each generally lasting for 5 to 25 minutes, are most often 4 in number and have been captured by the terms encounter, attending, negation, and realization, though many synonyms and alternatives are attested. Silence tends to be kept across such actions, though not always, and a somewhat histrionic commitment to ritual may often be observed, despite, for the most part, an overarching mood of what might be described as playful eccentricity. So much for the birds. They are a quirky bunch, and they thread themselves through the long history of aesthetics, museology, and performance in ways that reward scrutiny. That scrutiny is our task, the task of ESTAR Ser, but we're in ourselves birds, rather, in a manner of speaking, bird watchers. Onto the trunk. Standing slightly over 4 feet in height and 30 inches wide when closed, the physical object we have taken to calling the Frye Trunk is a handmade, wardrobe-style steamer trunk framed and strapped in Pacific silver fir, Abies amabilis, but paneled in a plywood that we believe was made by the saddle-based Elliott Bay Plywood Company circa 1920. Patterned leather surface treatments are from a later date. The pink aniline leather dyes, for example, were essentially unknown before the 1970s. The trunk, which is 18 inches deep, opens out from centerline front latches by means of hinging quarter blocks. These swing left and right to reveal an elaborately, if erratically finished case interior. Velveteen shelves and numerous specialized cubbies indicate an indeterminate number of refurbishings and customizations, and we believe we can discern the hands of no fewer than 4 different cabinet makers in the trunk's present disposition. As will be evident from this image, the Frye Trunk came to us packed to the gills with a profusion of disparate artifacts, laboratory equipment, casino fittings, home electronics from various eras, several books, a stash of archival documentation such as canceled checks, correspondence, and sheet music, optical devices, theatrical props, old maps, 2 boxes of golf spike wrenches, and many other medium-sized dry goods of a highly eclectic nature. It is the contention of the Frye Trunk working group of ESTAR Ser that this chest represents a veritable treasure trove of birdish memorabilia and materiel. Indeed, we believe it served as a portmanteau bureau for several generations of associates of the Avis Tertia, persons who conducted various underground attentional activities in and around Seattle across the 20th century. If this is in fact the case, we have to hand a very rich source from which to expand our understanding of the history of the Order of the Third Bird in the Pacific Northwest since 1890, and it is in the hopes of delivering on these hypotheses that we have undertaken the preliminary research presented in this report. That said, we may be wrong. As will be well known to readers of the proceedings, a perennial and profound challenge for ESTAR Ser researchers lies in the complex way that at least some associates of the Avis Tertia seem surprisingly committed to thwarting or misdirecting our historical investigations. The origins of this game, if it is that, can be traced back to the entangled incipit of ESTAR Ser itself, a community of scholars who, while very much not birds, the scholars of ESTAR Ser are forthright scholars, not evasive practitioners of elaborate rites of attentional ecstasy, nevertheless share territory with their subjects, and in a number of early cases can be shown to have defected from birdish ranks. There's also the simple matter of the Avis Tertia preferring at every turn to slip sideways from view and to evade any other forms of publicity or recognition that might decoy them away from their extravagant attentional focus. The birds seem to believe that simply birding, i.e. undertaking collective attentional practices in the style of the order, is sufficient unto itself, and that most everything else is a distraction. As they put it in one of their primary injunctions, in practice, practice. Practically speaking, however, some of them would appear to put in a fair bit of mischievous time and energy covering up their trails, muddying the relevant waters and strewing brightly painted red herrings along the path of those who would follow the workings of the order. Examples of this kind of misconduct are many and arguably funny, though those of us who have been again and again the butts of such jokes tend to dissent from this assessment. For instance, not only have associates of the order likely been behind the various disappearances of our journal and other publications from the shelves of research libraries, these same pranksters, or their friends, have also on multiple occasions made off with source material from our W cache collections, meaningfully hampering a number of historical investigations in the process. Or still, if admittedly more creative, especially imaginative, albeit unscrupulous, associates of the order seem to be behind a string of rather impressive forgeries and false finds of ostensibly birdish artifacts, sources on which ESTAR SARE researchers spend a good deal of time before coming to suspect the hand of those who would put us off the true path of bird history. Without belaboring the point then, it will be evident why, over the years, the scholars of ESTAR SARE have learned to be exceedingly cautious concerning new discoveries of juicy bird material, and why, more generally, we hedge our claims in a welter of it seemses and perhapses and apparentlys. These warnings sounded, we may proceed to a closer look at the provenance of the trunk we have called Frye, its contents, and the world out of which we take it to have come. For the most part, the scholars of ESTAR SARE focus attention on the rich repository of source materials already in our possession, the W cache, as discussed above. The bulk of this collection hails from the earliest days of ESTAR SARE. However, the cache is a living collection. It grows and changes, sloughing dead matter and metabolizing appropriate nourishment. For instance, the Committee on Holdings meets on an irregular basis, both to assess necessary deaccessions from the W cache, affected when materials in our collection are compelling deemed to be fakes, or are otherwise shown not to bear on the voracious history of the Order of the Third Bird, and to consider the acquisition of new objects or documents that have come to our attention as potential resources for ongoing research. Over the years, important materials have come into the W cache in this way. This is relevant context for a discussion of the provenance of the Frye Trunk, in that this object and its contents are not part of the original W cache and have not yet been formally accessioned into that repository. Rather, the trunk came to the attention of the Committee on Holdings in 2019, when a distinguished collector, connoisseur, and scholar resident on the east side of Manhattan approached the then holder of the B.B. Chamberlain Fellowship at ESTAR SARE's Milka Memorial Reading Room Library and mentioned having been apprised of the existence of an unusual and perhaps birdish artifact held in possession of an antiques dealer in Providence, Rhode Island. Following up on that tip, a small visiting party came together and a road trip ensued. The antiques dealer in question turned out really to be more along the lines of a thrift shop proprietor, although he does conduct a desultory trade in nautical ephemera and is very proud of a small barn that he has packed with rusty plows and other farm implements, which he insists are not for sale, despite having tried to sell us the whole lot on several occasions. He claimed to have acquired the trunk at a charity auction conducted by the Providence Athenaeum in 2015. This object in his possession was very definitely of the utmost interest to us, in that we immediately discerned, even at a glance, that it gave every indication of multiple crossing lines of association to birdish practices and communities. His asking price was, to be frank, outrageous, and only seemed to escalate as he sensed our enthusiasm. A cooling off period was deemed necessary. We will pass over here the final machinations that brought the trunk into our hands, but suffice it to say there was a good deal of haggling. In the end, however, the consensus is that Committee on Holdings mostly did get railroaded as far as these negotiations were concerned, and that the final price remained very, very high indeed. But that as it may, the trunk came into the possession of ESTAR SARE by the end of 2019, and a working group was convened to begin research on its contents. The particular timing of the acquisition of the trunk must be understood as fortuitous in the extreme. Indeed, there are those who would go so far as to say that a coincidence so exquisitely welcome ought always to be approached with kid gloves. Certain kinds of good luck need to be closely vetted, as they exude a plot-like air. The familiar way of speaking of such things is to call them too good to be true, a catchphrase that has always troubled our research community. In this case, it is absolutely true that the trunk came to our attention after ESTAR SARE had been contacted by the Frye Art Museum and commissioned to undertake an exhibition at that august institution. So in this sense, the scholars of ESTAR SARE were known to be on the lookout for birdish materials that might bear on the history of Seattle and the Pacific Northwest, given our general commitment to site-specific research projects. And so, yes, there is definitely something uncanny about the way the trunk popped up on the shady side of the antiques market shortly after rumors of our new project sifted out into the relevant networks. Those of us who have been part of the Frye Trunk Working Group have therefore been on the alert as we conducted our investigations. We have been punked before, and the present situation can be said to wear a number of the characteristics we've come to associate with the Lucy Pulls the Football game of archive heist that the birds seem so much to enjoy. Nevertheless, the contents of the trunk were, as we rotated them before our eyes and minds, so suggestive, so satisfying, so apropos that we decided to move forward unfolding the story we discerned in these sources while bracketing, at least provisionally, the larger problems we continue to sense. So we underscore here the basic fact. These materials could be an elaborate ruse or game or confection, but we have decided for the time being to play along, and we invite you to do the same. We shall see what can be achieved in this speculative, subjunctive key. All of this work is, of course, merely a preliminary sifting of this surprising repository. Research must continue, and it is possible that someday we will determine that the Frye Trunk is indeed some kind of trompe-l'oeil. Should that occur, we will, of course, promptly deaccession it. The W cache must be carefully shielded from every manner of historiographic illusion, every instance of make-believe. It is an archive for the proper history of the Order of the Third Bird, not a storage facility for those peculiar forms of not what meets the eye that, like the legendary painting by Zeuxis himself, get called art. On to Seattle. The trunk is full of Seattle-esque bits and pieces, and through a close examination of these sources, the Frye Trunk Working Group has gradually reconstructed a working theory for the formation and transmission of the artifact. Details of this story unfold episodically in the object essays that accompany this catalog, but it will be appropriate to concisely sketch the basic lineaments of our account here. We surmise that persons engaging in sustained durational practices of attention have worked in sporadic and intimate communities in the Seattle area for a very long time. They have done so in the context of labor and leisure, fashion and fear, hope and ministration. Those forms of conjoint sensory focus have included moments of great and lasting importance for countless individuals: prayer, entertainment, study, play, spectatorship, every manner of vigil and convocation. Art has played a role in a significant number of these occasions, but so too many other kinds of objects and situations and locations. In immensely diverse ways, then, collaborative attention has convened those who have shared in its choreographic powers. We interpret the trunk as evidence that some of these enterprises have been structured according to the quirky collective rights of radical attention, such as are known to be the special domain of the Avis Tertia. Prominent in the available writings of this group was a preoccupation with triads and various threefold analytics, a concern we chose to thematize in the wider Third Meaning exhibition. In short, then, we get the sense that this trunk has, over the years, served as a kind of portable office and mobile headquarters for several generations of birds in the Seattle area. These intergenerational and socioeconomically disparate friends appear to have used it to store elements of their attentional kit, various sensory prosthetics and tools, haberdashery of the guild, documentation of their doings, along with what seemed to be a clutch of inside jokes, pocket fluff, and miscellaneous desk supplies. The earliest materials in the trunk, a collection of atomizers and jewel glass perfume bottles, date to the late 19th century. The most recent, a portable TV and a cheap shaving mirror, look to have been added in the 1980s, though it is possible the trunk remained in active use even later than that, as suggested by a possible link to Capitol Hill's mystery soda machine, the heyday of which was in the 1990s. Specific documents contained in the trunk serve as anchors. Take, for instance, a letter from the accounts office of the Seattle Hardware Co. to one Mr. N.C. Larson, dated 13 December of 1902, which extends to Mr. Larson an additional 60 days for payment of a bill that had apparently come due. It is the case that volets, the clubs or groups of the birds, have a long history of incautious overspending in their intentional enthusiasms, and it is possible that Mr. Larson's little cohort had gone into debt purchasing the materials to construct one of the hideaway shacks beloved by those communities with a penchant for plein air actions of sustained attention. Admittedly, this is speculation. But that there is some relationship between the trunk and the Frye Art Museum itself, on this claim we are prepared to wager our scholarly reputations. Not for nothing have we come to call this Pandora's box of attentional artifacts the Frye Trunk. It has earned this name because of a host of tenuous but irresistible threads that clearly tie its existence to the Frye as an institution. We will lay out our evidence in more detail in the various object essays that accompany the exhibition, but we can point now to the title page and to the postcard of the Frye Museum from 1954, which we have reproduced here. It came to light in a sheaf of loose papers at the bottom of the trunk and reads on the back, Charles and Emma Frye Museum, Terry at Cherry, First Hill, Seattle, Washington. Opened in 1952, this free art museum is maintained entirely by Frye endowment funds and displays traditional European and American paintings. Rhododendrons seen left foreground are the Washington state flower. Lawns are green the year round in Seattle. This in itself is hardly proof of anything, but we believe that it was on cards like this that birds of a Seattle volet working at mid-century invited their associates to practices of sustained attention within the newly created Frye Museum. Evidence for these occasions, like all evidence of birdish gatherings, can be oblique and is thus easily overlooked by those not possessing a trained eye. After all, lots of bird actions merely look like people looking at works of art. But when an ESTAR researcher sees an image like the one reproduced here, it is impossible not to discern the subsonic hum of a protocol of sustained attention in the mode of the Avis Tertia. This photograph was taken shortly after the opening of the Frye Museum in 1952, and we believe it clearly shows a gaggle of young British attentionnauts engaged in an intentional reverie. One sees all the marks of an action here, the posture of focused regard, the phalanx of attendees, the clear way their eyes point to the object on which they have resolved to attend, the absence of any docent or guide holding the group in place. For all their love of collective ritual, the birds are a highly acephalous, even in a narcotic community. In fact, we suspect that the photographers captured the very moment that the group is shifting from the attending phase to the phase known as negation, where the participants temporarily withdraw or undo their focus. Close scrutiny reveals that the boy at the right edge of the image is beginning to suck on a lollipop, exactly the sort of thing that a practicing bird might do as a negating tactic, overwhelming his visual experience by means of an overload on a different sensory channel. And not only that, those who are familiar with the history of the Frye Art Museum will recognize the painting to which these school-age attentional performance artists are attending. It is Henry Rocken's full-length portrait of Charles Frye himself. A coincidence? Not likely. On the contrary, we are persuaded that the underground community of attentional adepts of Seattle can be shown to have links back to Charles and Emma Frye, who, we believe, were deeply committed to British practices of durational attention to works of art. Even the Greathouses, Walter Greathouse, the museum's first director, and his wife, Ida K. Greathouse, who had lived her husband and was the doyen steward of the museum for nearly 30 years, from 1966 to 1993, may well have been devotees of this special kind of radical attention. In fact, we have come to suspect that Delegate's 2004 portrait of Ida K. Greathouse, shown here, which we have arranged to hang prominently in the third meeting, actually depicts Mrs. Greathouse in the negation phase herself, to a triad of works that hang on the wall behind her, which we have reconstructed in the show. And triadic groupings like this play a special role in the attention story that emerges from the Frye Trunk. With this sidelong and wistful peep into a phantom world of attentional convivium and musical paideia, we bring this introduction to a close. Scientists studying the physiology and psychology of high-speed nocturnal aviation in the 1940s identified a phenomenon they called the autokinetic illusion. In such experiences, a stationary point of bright light, a star, a beacon, can, under conditions of intense concentration, begin to move. The scholars of ESTAR are drawn to this effect as a kind of metaphor. Where we look, where we attend with passion and care, things begin to move. As the obvious perils of autokinesis suggest, caution is required when this phenomenon kicks in. But as in the beautiful pinwheel illusions in which a static ring begins to rotate under scrutiny, there is a mesmeric power in those moments when objects of the world, given the attention they seem to seek, begin to dance. It is, we believe, a dance of joy, but one must stay still and pay close attention to catch a glimpse. Thank you.